With Shastriji's death in Tashkent, the question immediately arose about his successor. For an interim period, Sri Gulzari Lal Nanda was the acting Prime Minister. As I was the Shastri's secretary, I continued to be secretary to Sri Nanda. But he did not really devote much time to his duties as Prime Minister because the whole question as to who will be the new Prime Minister was under doubt. In fact, he spent most of his time consulting astrologers to see what his own prospects were. Finally, Srimati Indira Gandhi was chosen. Sri Morarji Desai, who was the contender, was disappointed, but he accepted the final verdict. I had, of course, known Indiraji from a much earlier period. Still, I went to her and said that the post of the Secretary to the Prime Minister is entirely a matter of personal choice for the Prime Minister. I would not be at all hurt or upset if I was not retained because I would be a secretary in my own right anyhow in one ministry or another. She said, no, I would like you to continue with me at least till the next parliamentary elections, and after that we can take a view about it. So I began serving her. She was, to begin with, extremely diffident. In parliamentary debates, a carefully prepared text had to be got ready for her use. All too often, members of the opposition would try to throw her off the text by interruptions to see whether she could again resume the thread of her presentation without facing difficulty. Ram Manohar Lohia was particularly on the attack. Once he referred to her as Gungi Gudiya. It was a very, very hostile atmosphere which she had in Parliament. At that very time, one very unpleasant incident was about to happen. There was to be an attack by some sadhus on Parliament in order to ensure a ban on cow slaughter. The Parliament House's compound gates had been closed, but they were threatening to scale over the walls and get into the house. Adityanath Jha was the Lieutenant Governor at that time. He sent a message to me, really meant for the Prime Minister, asking whether in these circumstances he could have recourse to firing. Now, I was then in the official gallery of Parliament. Mrs. Gandhi was about to reply to a no confidence motion. And I felt that if this question is flung at her at this hour, it will throw her off her balance. So without consulting her, I sent a message back that the Prime Minister would like you to do whatever you think necessary in order to preserve peace. And I took the responsibility for doing so, and I passed her the chit later, and she was very happy that I had disposed of it that time. Still, as the weeks and months went by, she gathered some strength, and it was clear that she would be the candidate for the next parliamentary election to be the leader and therefore to become the next Prime Minister. During that period, as I said, she had a difficult time because the parliamentary majority was a very small one, but she managed. She gave evidence of a great deal of political skill in dealing with problems, which quite frankly was not something to which I could make any contribution. I did much more work on the economic side of her activities. One such issue came about Indo-US relations, and particularly the decision to devalue the rupee. This has been and was a very controversial decision, led to a lot of attack on her. Now, as far as I can make out, the history of that event is as follows. I believed, and so did most people, that it was an open question for her to consider and that she decided upon it after her visit to Washington. Now, factually, I doubt if this is the correct position, because later, when I went to be the governor of the Reserve Bank, I discovered in the governor's top secret papers a communication from our executive director in the IMF, Mr. Anjaria, addressed to the finance minister, Mr. Sachin Chaudhary, with a copy to the governor, who was Mr. Bhattacharya, saying that as cleared by you, I have made a verbal statement to the fund board that we shall, in course of time, adjust the par value of the rupee in order to get out of the present balance of payments crisis. So that decision was made within days of Indira Gandhi coming to power. Had she cleared it? I'm not sure. I doubt it, because if it had come to her, she would have perhaps consulted me. So it is possible that the finance minister took this view on his own in consultation with Mr. Subramaniam and Mr. Ashok Mehta, who was in Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, because they were all very keen that because the World Bank had been attaching importance to devaluation and had promised that then the flow of aid to India for the next plan would be sizably stepped up, they were very keen that we should devalue and accept the recommendation, which, mind you, could be defended on merits also. Anyway, when the question was on the anvil, even after the pronouncement had been made in the fund and it came to be examined, a group consisting of Bhattacharya, Governor Reserve Bank, Bhutalingam, who was then Economic Secretary, myself as Prime Minister Secretary, and IG Patel as Chief Economic Advisor, was set up to go into the question. And we made a clear report that there are three possibilities. One was to devalue the rupee. The other was to do what Pakistan was doing at that time, namely to allow a part of the foreign exchange earned by exports to be retained by the exporter and sold by him at his own price at a premium, so that he could get more for his exports than otherwise and feel happy. Or third, that we embark upon a program of raising import duties and subsidizing our exports, which would have the same effect as devaluation, though it would not be carrying the name of devaluation. And we as a committee said that devaluation may be politically embarrassing, so perhaps the other two alternatives could be preferred. The finance minister took the view that political considerations are for him to take into account, and he would go along with the view which the Bhattacharya had, that straightforward devaluation is the best course. And eventually, that is what was accepted. Now, when Indira Gandhi was in Washington, certainly the president of the World Bank and the head of the International Monetary Fund both met her in my presence and urged very strongly about the desirability of devaluation. When she had her meeting with President Johnson, at that tete-a-tete meeting I was not present, but later on President Johnson came with her to the cabinet room when his cabinet colleagues were present and I and some others, B.K. Nehru, were present. And he said that he has had a good talk with the Prime Minister. He wants to help India's development, and we shall do through the World Bank and in the manner recommended by the World Bank. Now, one could say that this kind of phraseology used by the President was supportive of the World Bank approach that you had better devalue. But it would not, to my mind, be right to say that the US government took the initiative and the World Bank was following through. It was the initiative had originated from the World Bank team and by the IMF. Anyway, after devaluation, there was a big storm. I met with Indira Gandhi at her request, with her and also separately a lot of economists like Professor Gadgil and others. And many of the economists stood by the decision. They said it is a sound decision. But the political atmosphere was so fouled up that the follow up action, which might have been needed, was not taken in a state of uncertainty and political divisiveness. So the situation did not stabilize in the way that was hoped for, though one must record that after that, if you look over the years, the reserve position did take an upward turn. I mean, it was absolutely down at the bottom when devaluation took place. And though there was not an immediate impact, over the coming years, the reserve position began to improve. One can't attribute it all to devaluation, but devaluation did help on that front. The second thing, major initiative under Indira Gandhi's prime ministership while I was with her, in which I was involved, was in regard to nuclear disarmament. The initiative or the idea came from Dr. Vikram Sarabhai. He talked to me and said that we have to be very concerned because of China having a nuclear weapon. Now, the real threat from nuclear weapons arises not because they are used, but because of the danger of blackmail that they would be used. And therefore, the question is how to prevent nuclear blackmail. And therefore, if all the nuclear powers jointly made a declaration that they would immediately come to the aid of any non-nuclear power threatened by nuclear weapons, then the incentive for any country which is not nuclear to go nuclear, such as Pakistan, will disappear, and the likelihood of China using this threat against us would also recede. And when both USA and USSR are parties to such a declaration, then the guarantee will have credibility. Because if one power says so, there's still the danger that the other power might be on the other side and nothing will happen. I put this idea to Indira Gandhi and she was supportive of it. And thereafter, Vikram Sarabhai and I were sent on a mission to visit different capitals to sell this idea and seek support. We began with Moscow, and we both had meetings with Gromyko, who was then the foreign minister. And on the whole, his response was positive. Subsequently, I had a private interview with Kosygin, the prime minister. And he said that yes, we would go along with the idea, but because of the Vietnam War, we will not sign any kind of a joint declaration with the Americans. What we would be prepared to accept would be a declaration in identical terms made by each of us and by the other nuclear powers separately. So it will be for me to go and have an acceptable draft sold to the Americans also, because the Russians won't talk to the Americans on this issue. So having got this answer in the first round, we came back to India for fresh consultations. At that point, what I thought the Russians would agree to, I had reduced to paper. The Cabinet Committee on Political Affairs looked at it, thought it was good enough, but they made some suggestions to try to see if it can be strengthened one way or another. So with that kind of a clearance, I went on the second visit to Moscow first. This time, I found I got a very cold reception. I just couldn't get to see anybody except Deputy Minister. The reason was that in the meantime, Svetlana had come to India and escaped from here to the United States, and that had put Kosygin in a very embarrassing position, and India also was in a doghouse. It had gone to a stage when, I remember when I was there, Tagore's birthday was to be celebrated, and there was a function in the Indian embassy, as usual, inviting children from schools to come to that function. But no children came on the ostensible ground that they had to prepare for examinations. But the Indian children going to the same schools came back and said that somebody from the ministry had come and told them that you can't go to the function. So it had been boycotted. But even so, Gromyko did see me in the end and said that, well, I'm not going to change anything what I've said before, but nor am I going to add another word to what I have said. Now you try America. And I went to the United States, met many people, including President Johnson. President Johnson spoke in the warmest possible terms of Indira Gandhi because he had met her on the earlier visit. And he knew of her parliamentary difficulties. And he said, tell your Prime Minister that politicians in all countries are alike. They would stab their mother if it gives them a favorable press publicity. So not to be moved by what the politicians say, but those who have the responsibility for carrying their nation forward have to do the right thing by the light of their own courage. But then on the specific issue, he said that I have a difficulty with my Congress. If what you ask for is already covered by our commitment under the UN, then you don't need anything fresh. If it goes beyond that, then I can't give it to you without going to the Congress, and the Congress will never agree. So I think I'm in a dilemma, and I can't give you a categorical answer. It will need much fuller consideration. I wanted to see the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, but unfortunately, he was out, and I had a very tight schedule because I had my appointments with Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister, and the French Prime Minister made. So I had to leave Washington. I met the British Prime Minister and the French Prime Minister. The British Prime Minister said, well, whatever the Americans accept, we shall accept, so you shouldn't worry about that. The French Prime Minister did not, of course, take the line of whatever the Americans accept, but he analyzed the proposal. So his analysis was that, in fact, you are suggesting an instrumentality to outlaw the use of nuclear weapons in any war except between nuclear powers. So I said, well, you can interpret it in that particular manner. So he said, I am supportive of the idea, but again, to evolve the kind of consensus you are looking for, it will take time. You can't get it here and now. Now, I was under one more compulsion. This trip which I undertook was a month before I was to relinquish charge of my office with the Prime Minister and to resign from the ICS in order to take up the governorship of the Reserve Bank. So I couldn't pursue the initiative further. And apparently, it was looked upon as a very difficult task to get all the four powers to agree to a common draft, and no one pursued it with vigor. So that initiative remained, just allowed to die. My years in the Reserve Bank, I was happy to be back in my own economic sphere. I think I made many changes in the bank's outlook. I would refer to only one significant one, namely that I got an expert from Japan to assist me in this, and I introduced a system of financing exports at much lower rates of interest as a method of export promotion, which at that time paid very well. And I said that the reserves had begun to improve in the post-devaluation period. And those measures did help because the engineering industries of Bengal, particularly the wagon builders, who were in a state of depression because Railway Board had cancelled orders, began to turn to exports with the help of concessional finance made available. Now, it was while I was Governor Reserve Bank that the political storm within the Congress Party rather than not Congress began to gather, and Indira Gandhi had to face a situation of a split in the party. The question was at that point of time whether she would bow to the pulls and pressures from the right, which included S.K. Patil, Morarji Desai, and others, or whether she would move to the left. Eventually, she took the decision to take the leftist road, and in that, nationalization of banks became the front plank in the program. She sent for me and asked me for my views. I said that purely on the merits of the case, I would not say there is a need to nationalize immediately. We have introduced what is known as social control, under which the banks are required to give so much money to the agrarian sector, so much to the small scale industries, and distribute credit according to priorities. And already the nexus between the private owners and the banks has been very largely cut down, if not eliminated. So we can afford, in purely economic terms, not to do it. But a political judgment is also to be taken, and that is yours. Well, apparently, her first view was not to nationalize because J.R.D. Tata, who saw her the day after I had seen her and talked to her, also came to see me and said that, well, I talked to her and she told me that she's not nationalizing the banks. But 48 hours later, she decided to go through with the nationalization. Thereafter, Morarji resigned and the party was split and all kinds of things happened, which are matters of history. Soon after that, this happened in 1969, in December 69, when I came to see her, and I asked her that I think the Reserve Bank governor's role has now got greatly reduced with the nationalization of banks, so I was not finding it terribly exciting to do so. Shouldn't I fade out from there and come into the Rajya Sabha or do something else? So she said, no, I have got a different idea for you. If strange you talked to me about leaving the bank, I was going to suggest something different, namely you go as ambassador to America. I said, good God, what for? I'm not a diplomat, and anyhow, America and India are not going to be great friends, so why should I go and be the ambassador there? So she said, this is a very important thing, she said, that look, when I talk of America, I think not of the US government alone. I think much more of the American people. And with the American people, we have had very good ties in the past. They are very supportive of our freedom movement. And there is no reason why we should not have, with the United States, particularly the American people, as friendly relations as we have with the Soviet Union. But this needs an effort, which is not just a diplomatic effort of going to the State Department, but of communicating with the American people, the academics, the journalists and others. And you have got friends, you are known in the academic circles as well as the American public for various other reasons. That's why I want you to go. So I said, all right, if you say so, I'll go. So I went and I began life as an ambassador. I found it a little boring in the beginning. Somebody asked me, you are doing your first stint as an ambassador. How does it differ from your previous assignments? So I said, well, it is more of a strain on my liver and kidneys than on my brain. But soon the complexion changed because war clouds began to gather over Bangladesh, and US and India were going very much in opposite directions on that issue. But prior to that, Henry Kissinger was making a very special private effort with me to establish Indo-American friendship. Now, he was keeping the State Department out of it altogether, and he knew that because I had access to the Prime Minister, what he told me would not go to the Foreign Office but to the Prime Minister. And he was saying that, look, we understand your relations with Soviet Union. You have got very good reasons to be friendly with them. That does not mean that we should not be friendly. So can we not have better relations? Now, this was in keeping with the charter which Indira Gandhi had given me, so I encouraged him And we pursued the conversation and we became, well, very good friends. Then the whole scenario changed when he got a quicker breakthrough to China than to India. He was trying both India and China. And when the Pakistanis helped him to go to China, then of course it became for him a real victory. And he also knew that by the same token, now chances of being closer to India would be diminished because China also had a posture of hostility towards India. So had Pakistan, which had helped America and China to get together. So when this happened, there came a distinct change in American attitude, particularly over Bangladesh. But here on Bangladesh, I must recount that the first person to say that the birth of Bangladesh is inevitable was no other than Henry Kissinger himself. He said so to me on 16th April 1971. And he, having been a refugee from Germany, he had a sympathy with the plight of refugees, and refugees touched him to the core in a way other Americans were not touched. So he began by saying that no, Bangladesh is inevitable. But he had to change his tune later because of the President Nixon's own attitude. And he later said, well, when I said that to you, I meant in course of time it will happen and not that there will be armed fighting. Now, when the trouble began to come near bursting point, Indira Gandhi herself came on a visit to America to have chat with President Nixon. Of course, that was a futile journey. There was no way in which Nixon could change his mind, but still she had gone there because she felt she had to do her duty, and she had explained her position to various capitals, not merely to America. Now, during the time Indira Gandhi was in Washington, I was sent for by the State Department and told that since our Prime Minister had been emphasizing the importance of a dialogue between President Yahya Khan and Mujibur Rahman, they had been able to get an assurance from their ambassador in Pakistan that President Yahya Khan was not prepared to consider meeting a representative of Mujibur Rahman, but not Mujibur Rahman himself. So it was a very qualified statement, prepared to consider, not prepared to meet, and to meet only a representative of Mujibur Rahman and not Mujibur Rahman himself. So I made the comment that how could Mujibur Rahman brief a representative of his to talk on his own behalf so long as he is in jail and does not know what is happening, what is the situation on the ground. That he has got assurance from the President of Pakistan that he will be prepared to consider meeting a representative of Mujibur Rahman, but not Mujibur Rahman himself. And this was conveyed to me that will that not provide a basis for holding up things? So I said, look, how can anyone meet on behalf of Mujibur Rahman without his meeting Mujibur Rahman and Mujibur Rahman coming out of jail to see the situation what it is? Sitting in jail, Mujibur Rahman cannot brief anybody to talk on behalf of him. So unless he is released, we don't think there's a dialogue on. We are trying for a dialogue, but this dialogue won't take place unless he is released. Because that is impossible. So anyway, that thing fizzled out and hostilities broke out. Thereafter, I was summoned to the State Department and asked for an assurance that we would not carry it to the point of trying to break up Pakistan and annex Pakistani territory. I said, that assurance I can give you straight away. We won't. It's purely a question of liberation of Bangladesh. We have nothing, we're not at war with Pakistan in the sense that we don't want to do anything to Pakistan itself. So West Pakistan is completely outside. Then he said that would you give the same assurance regarding that part of Kashmir which is under Pakistan at present? He said, look, we don't recognize that as part of Pakistani territory. So to give you the assurance that if we capture any part of that territory, we are going to release it, would be to recognize the sovereignty of Pakistan, which we are not prepared to do. But let me ask you, I said, a counter question. Supposing Pakistan occupied a bit of Kashmir which is on our side, can you give us the assurance on their behalf that they will not stay there and they will vacate it? Have you got that assurance? So they said, well, no, we can't give you the assurance. Then the question doesn't arise. A day later, the news came that the 7th Fleet is moving into the Bay of Bengal. Now, most people thought that something has leaked out to our people, and I sent a message here. But it was my judgment that is not a leak but a plant, in the sense that they're deliberately letting us know this very secretly and indirectly in order that we may be frightened and pull back. Having been ambassador in America and knowing the kind of feelings aroused by Vietnam, I knew that they could not possibly open another front in Asia. So to have the meat in fire, I called a press conference the moment I heard of this. And the press people came and said, Mr. Ambassador, you have anything to say to start? I think, look, I can't say it off my own cards, but I would like you on the record to ask me the question whether the United States is being neutral in this conflict. So this question was asked, the TV cameramen were there, the radio men were there, press were there. I said, well, I believed so, and I have had this assurance before, but I have had a very disturbing news, I don't know whether it is true, that the 7th Fleet is sailing towards the Bay of Bengal. So they said, Mr. Ambassador, you can't be serious. We can't open a second front in Asia. You know what's happening in Vietnam. I think I know that only too well. So I don't believe it at all. But when I got this report from an unconfirmed source, I went to the State Department to ask, and they said, we have no comment. So they didn't deny it. So I'm very worried, but you people in the press might know better. And next morning, it was within hours, it was in television, radio, and everything. And there was all hell let loose in the media. So next morning, I was sent for by the State Department, and there was a message from the President, which was read out to me, that the US President finds it intolerable the way the Indian ambassador is using American media to attack the American administration. So I said, look, I did not utter a single word in criticism of the US government. In fact, I don't believe this story. I only mentioned that I had heard this, and it was not denied by the State Department. I did not make any comment of my own except to say I don't believe it myself. So you can't fault me. So they had to accept that I was technically perfectly within my rights in whatever I said, and nothing happened. Then the next day, they sent for me. And before I could get there, I got the news that we had announced a unilateral ceasefire. So when I went there, I was told that we called you because we have now the assurance from Pakistan that if they occupy any part of your Kashmir, they will vacate it. So we wanted to convey it to you. But we believe that there has been a ceasefire already. I said, yes, we've announced ceasefire. I told you we have no intention to capture Pakistan, and so that is the end of the matter. Well, so it rested. I stayed as ambassador for another until early 73. Just before leaving, the President of the United States sent for me, which is he rarely meets people, certainly not ambassadors on their road. And he, probably prompted by Kissinger, said, well, Mr. Ambassador, you were very much against us, but you were doing the right thing for your country, and we admire you for what you did. So I came back, and then Kissinger, in his White House years, referred to me in rather flattering terms. and he sent me a copy of his book with the covering letter, "My dear LK, you are the only Indian about whom I have said anything nice in my book. I hope it won't do permanent damage to your reputation in India." So that ended the American chapter. Then I was sent to Kashmir as governor. I said, again, Indira Gandhi asked me, I said, look, why do you want me to go to Kashmir? I have not even been a district magistrate in my life. How can I be a governor of a state? They can, no, there are serious matters. We are having a dialogue with Sheikh Abdullah, and I want like you to go because you will be able to command more respect than a politician whom you won't trust. So I went, and then a series of negotiations were going on, leading to the Kashmir Accord. Again, that is a part of history. I don't want to dwell on it in length, but I want to give one or two side issues or side snippets and sidelights. For Sheikh Abdullah, it was a matter of great importance to be called Prime Minister of Kashmir and not Chief Minister of Kashmir. And that no one was prepared to accept. He had been Prime Minister earlier, but it could not be revived. So he said he should be called Wazir-e-Azam, which would have meant the same thing, but was ultimately said, no, we will call Wazir-e-Ala. Yes, I won't call myself Chief Minister. I'll only call myself Wazir-e-Ala. That's fair enough. No, that compromise was accepted. And then, with that background, other things being settled out, there was a decision that now Sheikh Abdullah will be sworn in as Chief Minister and the Congress party will support him. And there was a meeting of the Congress Legislative Party of Jammu and Kashmir to elect him as their leader, which would give me as governor the right to have him sworn in as Chief Minister. About 45 minutes before this was to happen, Indira Gandhi rings me up from Delhi and says, LK, we can't have him elected as leader of our party because then it will mean handing over the party to him. Some of my party men here are objecting to this. So he said, Devkant Barua, the Congress president, is in Jammu, but I can't get hold of him, so now you have to do something about it. He can't be sworn in as that. Now please go ahead on this basis. So I began to try to locate Sheikh Sahab and also sent for Barua. So Barua came and I told him this, and then Sheikh Sahab and Beg came. Now Barua began his conversation with Sheikh by saying that, Sheikh Sahab, you want to be called Wazir-e-Azam. Actually, in Persian, the correct word is Wazir. You don't say Adam or Alam or anything. Wazir means the head of the government. So Sheikh Sahab thought that now they are going to drop the Allah also. Just call me Wazir. So he was feeling a little sarcastic. Look here, Barwa Sahab, let's go into your Persian literary subtleties. I think the one point which I wanted to raise with Sheikh Sahab was whether it would be appropriate for him to be called the leader of the Congress party or a leader of the House, because House means he has command of all parties and not, he doesn't bear a party label. Now, Sheikh somehow seemed to react positively to it. In fact, he had been toying with the idea of joining the Congress even. So he thought, but when I said leader of the House, he thought it's something bigger than party. But Beg chipped in. Beg was a very clever man in these things. He chipped in. Why are you having some second thoughts? Who am I to have second thoughts? I don't know anything about party affairs. I'm the governor. I'm purely going by the constitutional proprieties that you should be elected leader of the House, then you become, which the Chief Minister will be. If you become leader of the party, then it means you're joining the party or accepting its discipline. Then you have to accept discipline of the party leaders in Delhi also. So Sheikh Sahab, little hesitantly, but he says, yes, that is all right. But at that point of time walked in Karan Singh and he said, Sheikh Sahab, congratulations, you are going to become leader of our party. So we had again the ball, go back to square number one. But still, I winked at him, but he wouldn't understand. But anyway, that thing was over and he went straight to the party meeting. Now the trouble was I couldn't pass the word to the party people, much less to the Chief Secretary, who released to the press the prepared text of Sheikh Sahab's speech, with the caption, his speech when being elected leader of the Congress party. Well, these things nobody noticed. But then that evening, the report of the parliamentary debate on the subject came on the radio. And we were dining at D.D. Thakur's house. It was supposed to be a very joyous occasion that Sheikh Sahib had been elected, and then he heard one of the comments made in Parliament. I think Prime Minister said it or somebody else said it. That, well, he will be known as, whatever he may be known as inside the J&K, when he comes to Delhi, he is the Chief Minister, nothing different. So Sheikh felt it again. What is this happening? So next morning, 9 o'clock, there was to be swearing in. BBC television, everybody was there. No sign of Sheikh Sahib. So I said, now this was the real crisis. Mir Qasim, the outgoing Chief Minister, he was with me, so I had to send him. And he had took about half an hour to persuade Sheikh Sahib that, look, these things happen. Somebody says something you don't take seriously. Come, you are now becoming the power here. So at last he came and was sworn in, and the relationship between him and me was always very good. Then we came to the crisis when Indira Gandhi went out of office, lost her elections. The very next day, the Congress members who had been supporting him in office, because Indira Gandhi had said so and they had no option, they sent me a written thing that they are withdrawing support from him. And therefore, his government could not continue. Now, the congressmen wanted that they should be asked to form a government. I was not very happy with that prospect, so I flew to Delhi. I went and talked to Indira Gandhi. Look, this accord means a much bigger thing than a party matter. That Sheikh is solidly with India is a very big thing, and we don't want to create a situation in which he again goes to the wilderness. So she said, well, I agree with you, but what can I do now? I am nobody. Mr. Chavan, he is in the parliament and he is the next man in the party, so you go and talk to him. I went to talk to Chavan, but by then Karan Singh had talked to him, and Karan Singh was also anxious to have Sheikh out. So he was said that, no, I can't interfere in the matter anyhow. Now it is for the youth to settle it with the new government, which is of Morarji Desai. So I went to Morarji Desai. Morarji Desai said, look, I don't want to take a partisan position at all. I'm not concerned with Congress or Sheikh, but you must be constitutionally correct, and I would like you to take the advice of my law minister, discuss with him the legalities. So I went to the law minister and I said to him that in the Jammu Kashmir constitution there is a provision under which the governor can assume the powers with the concurrence of the president. So the power is mine. Central government has only to agree to it, or the President of India, which means central government has to agree to it, rather than to initiate it as a president's rule. Now, under the constitution, it says that if the government cannot be carried on according to the constitutional provisions, like the assembly has not met, the budget has not been passed, and no new government can present a budget and pass it. So there is a completely sound legal reason to hold that the government must be carried on and the governor alone can pass the budget. So for me to take the powers. And then I said that the state cabinet has sent a recommendation to dissolve the assembly. Now this again, I said that Jammu Kashmir has its own constitution. It provides in terms that the cabinet recommendation shall be acted upon by the governor. So in these circumstances, what is the legal position? So he said that legal position clearly is that you must have governor's rule and you must dissolve the assembly and hold elections. So the assembly was dissolved. Then came the next stage of the drama. The Janata Party wanted Sheikh to have a compromise with them and become aligned to them as it was earlier with the Congress. Sheikh was quite prepared to go along with some form of a settlement with Janata, and many others who had experience or hope that the party in power in the center will rig the elections wanted to join Janata so as to be on the ground floor and to get into power along with the Sheikh. And then Ashok Mehta, who was there on behalf of the Janata government, he was so optimistic that he asked, will there be an opposition left or shall we have a one-party rule of Janata in Kashmir? But what broke down the understanding between the two parties was that when Ashok Mehta wanted a written commitment from Sheikh, which he was not prepared to give, that he will give this and so many seats and all that. On the failure of that, Sheikh began to fight the election, which is back to the wall. He again went back to the accession is only for 3 subjects. Center has usurped our powers. But then cap it all, he had a heart attack and he could not do the electioneering. But the very sympathy which arose for him in that state was again doing more votes for him than anything else. And what got the Janata even fewer votes was that when leaders like Jagjeevan Ram, Charan Singh and Morarji went, they didn't even go to his house to ask after his health, though he was known to have had a severe heart attack. So here was a real fight brewing between Janata on the one side, Congress somehow in the doldrums, and Sheikh, which is lying in bed. Now, all the Janata people who had joined there, they were hoping that I as governor will see to it that Janata gets elected because Janata is in power in the center. But I talked to Morarji. I said, look, Morarji bhai, you don't want me to be unfair in elections. He said, no, not on your life. I don't care if we don't get a single seat. Morarji in these matters was, he had a certain integrity which was tremendously important. He said, no, I want you to ensure fair elections. So with that charter, with fair elections, Sheikh came back to power. And when I swore him in, I said to him, Sheikh Sahab, people don't like to part with power, but I as governor am very happy to part with my power and give it back to you because you are the chosen leader of the people. Then Sheikh made a very memorable speech. He said, Mr. Governor, all is fair in love, war and elections. I have been naughty, I have said many naughty things. But from now on, we promise to be good boys. So with one speech, he wiped out all his extreme statements and he again came back in the mainstream. Now, with Janata government there, Sheikh maintained his good relations with Indira Gandhi. I mean, whenever Indira Gandhi came, he gave her a warm reception because although he had been put into prison in Nehru's time, he had a certain regard for the Nehru family, which never wavered. So, Sheikh maintained this thing and, well, when I was leaving, he wouldn't let me leave Kashmir. So I had served longer than any governor ever did. I was there for 8 years. And after I left, and I went again to see him before he died. It was a very good, happy association I had with him, and I left him with a feeling of great admiration, despite his angularities and weaknesses, which were many. I think it was a very, very important contribution which he made to the history of the country and particularly relationship between the Kashmir's accession to India and its continuing evolution of good relations. To the developments which have taken place, I think, in my opinion, it was a mistake to have dismissed Farooq Abdullah. He had certainly done many things which were stupid, childish, and indefensible. But he could have been brought to book and continued. But even if he did go out of office, it was a question of making a correction sometime or other, because obviously this new government was not really doing anything which the people would have judged to be good or even fair and honest. And the fact that Congress was seen to be supporting him did the Congress a lot of harm. In fact, the Kashmiri Pandits who at least used to be with the Congress, even they began to join Farooq Abdullah, because Sheikh Abdullah also had the Kashmiri Pandit support, rather than be with the Congress or GM Shah. So the fact that once again, in somewhat similar situations, though there were variations in detail, the governor thought it fit to impose governor's rule is, to my mind, a very sound decision, and it enables now for the democratic process to assert itself, and either Farooq comes back to power now with the support of the majority of members, or there is an election, it is fair and open, then whoever comes to power is sworn in. But so long as there is a fair election, I would not say it should be Farooq or anybody else, that's none of my business. But the fact that I had given the Kashmiri people a really fair and free election was, to my mind, one of the biggest factors in turning their mind away from Pakistan. Because when Pakistan was under the rule of a dictatorial rule, no elections at all, for them to say have a plebiscite in India when they couldn't even have an election was just carrying no conviction. Now, with this kind of a return to democratic norms, I'm sure that this will be the biggest factor in fighting back the anti-national elements who had gained strength in the recent past.